about where you were born and your family and some of your childhood? Because this one of the things we're trying to do with all the people we talk to is get some sense of where people are coming from in terms of the values that they bring to their activism, the kinds of people that influence them. Some, looking for similarities in their backgrounds and their upbringings, which we're, starting to find in some ways. I mean, there start to be some kinds of patterns. So it seems like a good place to start. And maybe you could just talk about where and when you were born, and talk about your family a little bit, and history and background.
Okay. Well, my name is Charles Prejean, and I was born in the heart of Cajun country in southwest Louisiana, Lafayette, Louisiana, 1941, May 6, 1941. And I'm the third child, the first son in a family of 7 children. And I guess, like as far as those factors that influence my development are those normative ones: the family, school, church, and some people in the community, members of my church and ministers in my church, and the nuns who taught us in elementary school. The family was a large family, a large extended family. Well, the nuclear family was pretty large, 7 children, although large to today's standards was not so large then. Lived near grandparents. I'm one generation removed from the old agricultural tenant farming activities. My grandfather was still on the shack, was still sharecropping when I was a young boy, but my parents, once they were married, they lived in Lafayette, and Daddy got a job in the city at a service station, and eventually with the railroad, Southern Pacific Railroad. Mother was a homemaker, and she stayed and took care of us. Probably worked harder than Daddy, trying to raise 7 children that were steps. The first 2 were on 11 months apart, and I came about 12, 13 months later, and the rest came in a similar fashion. So, like I'm a product of that rural environment and that rural way of thinking and viewing reality.
Had your grandparents lived there? Had they grown up and lived in that part of Louisiana?
Yeah, my grandparents and their parents and were born in southwest Louisiana and lived there all their lives. There was a strong sense of family and responsibility to family and responsibility to community. It was ingrained in us that the progress that we can make in society was due to the contribution that those who came before us made to us. And we were always encouraged to advance and improve ourselves and to return something to the community. That communitarian philosophy was preached into us by our parents, by the schools, and by the church. The nuns themselves were models to us because they had accepted what they perceived as a vocation in life to serve others and to make a contribution so that the whole of the community could benefit. The same way with the Catholic priests in our in our parish church.
What kind of farming then did they were tenant farmers?
Tenant farmers, cotton. They grew cotton. Cotton was still grown crop in that area. They did cotton and sweet potatoes were the main cash crops that they were involved in. Really, it never could get beyond the system itself, because once you get caught up into it, it's hard to really get out, because usually you make barely enough to pay off the indebtedness that you incurred during the course of the year.
Yeah.
The Southwest Louisiana is rich because of its cultural contributions by African Americans, and the Latin culture, the French and the Spanish culture, and also the Anglo contribution. So you had a number of cultures coming together in this particular area. For instance, my grandparents could not speak English, maternal and paternal. So their way of expressing themselves and their view or defining the way they find reality probably was the same as the Anglos or the Les Américains defined it, but they expressed it in much different ways. We were forced to learn the language so that we could communicate with them and to understand that diversity, even cultural diversities, had a richness in and of itself, and we became more tolerant to the differences because we had it so concretely before us. But I learned early on that, there were certain kinds of responsibilities on the part of the individual and to himself and to his community. And I didn't realize the extent to which that had been drilled into me at so early an age. And it wasn't until high school that I began to understand that was part of who I was. And I had been not only conditioned to think along those lines, but my person itself was more inclined to look at things in that way. I left home at 13 to enter the seminary to study for the Catholic priesthood with the group in Mississippi, in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. It's a society of priests called the Society of the Divine Word, or the SVDs. It's a German order, a missionary order, and they had established seminaries in this country, I guess in the early 20th century, I think. But their main facilities and their main work was in the heartland of the country, in Illinois and Iowa and places like that. But they soon began to branch out, and they decided to start a seminary for African American vocations to the priesthood in Mississippi. I think they first started around in the Greenwood area, and that didn't work too well. And I think it was some antagonism or some difficulties that were presented to them. They were mainly all white priests and catering or trying to address the spiritual needs of black Catholics. And so they moved to a more neutral place, somewhat of a suburban place, a suburb of New Orleans in a sense, or at least summer home area for the rich from New Orleans.
Oh, that's right.
It's 50 miles east of New Orleans, Bay St. Louis. So they opened a seminary there and began taking young men who expressed an interest in that vocation, accepting them right after elementary school.
Wow. Was that normal? Or
that was pretty normal in those days. They don't do it anymore. I don't think they will accept you into the seminary until either after high school or after college now. And I think it's more so after college they may consider your interest into the priesthood. But that was pretty normal, taking us at that early an age and using that period in high school and college to help form our spiritual selves. But again, the experience, the reason why I entered the seminary was because I wanted to serve others. I wanted to serve a community of needs. And I was less interested in being a missionary, going to work in a foreign country. I wanted to return to Southwest Louisiana or some rural area and serve there. But in the seminary, we had these communal responsibilities. You know, we had to look out for the community as a whole, and each person was given a responsibility and was held accountable for those kinds of fulfillment of those kinds of responsibilities, because everything would fall apart if everyone didn't do his job. So, you know, I remained in the seminary through high school and 1 year of junior college, and I left because I thought that as I got older, I realized that I did not want to be a priest. I thought that I could make a better contribution, whatever that contribution was to be as a layperson. I wanted a family. I wasn't ready to get married then, but I thought more in terms in the future of having a family and having children and serving the community and serving God in that way. So I left and returned to Lafayette, Louisiana, and into the University of Southwestern Louisiana, and completed my undergraduate training at the University of Southwest Louisiana in the humanities, in French, and major in French and minor in history.
Let me just go back a little bit on I'm interested in the land. How aware were you when you were growing up of the kind of situation of your grandparents, say, or what it meant for your father and your mother to move off of the land and come into town, and how?
Well, I think my mother was already in Lafayette, so she left. She was not born on the farm. Her parents worked as tenants, you know, in that area, or as sharecroppers in that area. My paternal grandparents, almost accepted this reality, but had always, I could discern from some of the discussion, always had this desire to own their own plot of land and to sustain the family in that fashion. But it seemed as if, you know, after a certain period in my grandfather's life, when that wasn't possible, he resigned himself to that particular situation and made the best out of it. But you could tell in his discussions, you know, with us that it wasn't a bitterness or a hatred, but it was all a sadness on his part that he had worked so hard all of his life, and he had not been able to, at the end of his time on the farm, he was not able to remain in that area to take care of himself, because once he reached, I think, about age 70, he decided to give it up because he couldn't do it anymore. Yeah. And he moved to a little village about 4 miles west of Lafayette, and he started cutting hair, and he lived in a home that had belonged to a nephew of his. He started cutting hair and working part-time even at that age, and saved up enough money for a down payment on a lot, and he built a small house for himself. And although, you know, that seemed to please him quite a bit, to be able to do that. And he lived till he was 87, I think it was. So, you know, that offered him some satisfaction to be able to do that. It was a village and a rural community, and he cut hair until he died. He was a barber until he died. Not so much for the money, because he only charged the folks, you know, 40 or 50 cents for a haircut, if that much. And those who couldn't pay, you know, didn't pay. He appreciated the socializing that occurred at barbershops. And folks would come and tell their stories about their lives and reminisce about that, and they would joke, and that seemed to satisfy him.
Really a center of a social life.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And especially, it wasn't just the older folks, the senior citizen, those persons his own age, but he was happy to see the young folks too. And the young folks who were born in the rural areas were taught Creole as their first language, so they communicated quite well with him, and he liked that. Those of us who lived in Lafayette or in the city, had to struggle to communicate, although we could, but it wasn't as facile a way of communicating as if we were doing it every day with them. So, you know, like I would say that family, church, were important agents of socialization in my life, or conditioning in my life, and that spirit of community, that sense of community and contributing to community, you know, had a tremendous influence on me. Now, I never could understand why it was so difficult for my grandparents and even my father, especially on the farm. And, you know, it bothered me that they had to work so hard and to enjoy so little of from their efforts. It bothered me even more as my grandfather got older, and he had nothing really left in life. He couldn't work anymore, and he only had us to visit with, and he couldn't read, he couldn't write, and he didn't have a television. He had a radio, and he would listen to the Creole music and the Cajun music on that, and he enjoyed that. But that seemed as if, you know, like there was a person who worked all his life, and his value to society was as a worker, and that once that value was no longer there, you know, he did not seem to have a place in society. Yeah. I didn't want that to happen to me, and I didn't want it to happen to anybody else. And I just thought that there's a certain logic to being to human essence that need to be expressed and fulfilled. And I made a determination that I would do it for myself, and in the process of doing it for myself, doing it for the larger community, and maybe I would be able to reap those benefits accordingly.
Were most of the people that you grew up with Catholics?
Yeah, yeah.
So that was,
in my time, I would say the Lafayette community was over 90% Catholic, both black and white population.
Yeah.
That's changed since then because of the expansion of the oil industry. You have folks coming in from all over Texas and North Louisiana and Oklahoma and whatnot. So you have a much more integrated community as far as religiously than you had when I was coming up. But that's all we knew. In fact, we didn't know there were public schools, you know, in the lower elementary grades. We thought that all schools were Catholic schools. And even now, many of your families send their children to Catholic parochial schools, white and black, in that area. I might add that in seventh or eighth grade, I forget when it was, a person came to our parish, a young Catholic priest, Father McKnight. You probably know Father McKnight. And you know, I think he had a tremendous influence on me. He brought he was from New York. He brought new ideas into the community and in our discussions. And he seemed to have a strong conviction towards the improvement of circumstances for black folks in that area. Although the first few years in the community, his emphasis was more on his responsibilities with the church, religious education for the youngsters in the parish. He worked with the altar boys, and he worked with adults also. But shortly after, several years after he moved to Lafayette, he started expanding his activities into areas of adult literacy training, and even after that into economic activities like credit union development and cooperative development.
So he was your parish priest?
He was an assistant parish priest.
Oh, I didn't know
Yeah.
that.
Right. And I was in Altamore. Read the Ford Foundation. There's a study, not a study, but an investigation that the Ford Foundation did on the Federation and me in the early 1970s, and over that the dispute that we had with them, and McKnight and I had at that particular point in time. And I thought, I don't know how certain it is, I thought at one time they did. They went to my hometown and visited my college and everything else, and came up with this report saying that, well, you know, Charles really was an understudy of McKnight, and we got this money to give, and we'll give it to McKnight rather than Prejean. But anyhow, you know, like, I thought it was an effort to discredit me. But, you know, Father and I were friends for a long time, and we still are friends. And the notion of cooperative economic enterprising was introduced to me by Father, because even while I was in the seminary, when I returned during the summer, I worked with him in the adult literacy training programs that he had, and in cooperative credit union development and then cooperative development. And once I finished college, and after teaching school for 2.5 years at a black Catholic high school, I came on to work with the Southern Cooperative Development, Southern Consumers Cooperative, as a full-time staff person. In the meantime, I had been working with them as a volunteer, as a community organizer, but only on a volunteer basis in the afternoons and the evenings, you know, doing some community organizing and membership solicitation and holding educational sessions for small groups of people to introduce them to co-op principles and things of that sort.
Well, do you think you got a better education through Catholic school than you would have if you went to kind of segregated public schools in the South?
Well, it's hard. I never experienced both, so it's hard to tell. I thought that I'm satisfied with my education, even in the elementary school education, because I thought that the nuns were very serious with their work, and they were well trained. Of course, I can't say enough about my training in the seminary, because it was really a quality and broad, although the emphasis was on the humanities, and it was a strong training. The priests were well trained and very dedicated, and demanded excellence in the classroom. And they forced us to express our talents to our fullest. And so, my training was somewhat of an aberration to the normative sort of training that folks have. But I thought the schools were good. I think the public schools became better after integration, or shortly before it, as the demand for qualification became greater, and more blacks were going to college and finishing in areas of education. At one point in time, you didn't have degreed teachers, teaching in the public schools. You had those who had gone 1 or 2 years to college, or had 1 or 2 years of college experience. The influence that Father McKnight had on me was a positive one, and it introduced me to a world. It accelerated my introduction to the national community and the world community, to as great, almost as great an extent as my priest teachers in the seminary, because some of them were from Europe and introduced us to that world in the classroom. Some of them were also African Americans who had gone through the training and were now black priests, and so they had come back from the missions, in Africa and China and Indonesia, and introduced us to those world of experiences. And then father came from the north, you know, with a new way of looking at things and some interesting ideas, and you know, we tag along with him on his vacations to New York and Washington D.C.
You
and
would go up
right, as altar boys and whatnot, you know. And he and I became very, very close. And so, you know, I did a lot of things with him that the other altar boys didn't do. I live a block away from the church, so I was there at 6 o'clock in the morning to serve his masses and what have you, you know. So I cannot say too much about that influence with Father McKnight and my education. But what we did in the late 50s and early 60s, you know, we really began focusing in on cooperative economics. We were reading as much as we could. We were sending some of our people to co-op training institutes and co-op colleges. We even sent folks to the Cody Institute of what is it called? It was in Nova Scotia, and I don't know if it was some university there, but there was something called the Cody Institute for Cooperative Training, or something like that, where the emphasis was on it was called the Antigonish movement of cooperative economic development. And, you know, it was cooperative economics in its purest form. By that I mean as pure as it can be, and not be pure communism. It was still with some emphasis on free enterprise way of doing things, but in a collective fashion. It was entrepreneurialism being manifested in the context of a group enterprise rather than a single proprietorship or individualistic sort of undertaking and whatnot.
What kind of cooperatives were you trying to create or organize or to work with?
Well, in Louisiana, the first cooperative that we started was Southern Consumers Cooperative. It was a consumer cooperative, but it was organized as a holding company with co-op bylaws and principles. You know, by that I mean, you know, the emphasis was on economics and business development to satisfy need, employment need, and income to sustain yourself and your family. The principle of one man, one vote, or one person, one vote. It was not for profit, but to satisfy need, as I said. And the democratic principle is not so much how much money you had invested, but that you were a member and a participating member in the organization. The individual was more important than the money. It was that kind of emphasis. So Southern Consumers Cooperative was organized as a holding company with two subsidiaries, an educational arm, because we also argued that we needed continuous education to understand more deeply and these principles and to spread the gospel of cooperative economics, and also to counter the other conditioning factors that were suggesting that we ought to do business a different way. And the second business, a subsidiary business, was a loan company, a credit union. We wanted to. These were state businesses. They were all had state charters. You know, they could operate throughout the state. We wanted a statewide credit union, but we could not get a charter because it was the credit union league argued that that wasn't a common enough bond. So we created a small factoring company and applied co-op or credit union principles or credit union bylaws to that. And those three businesses are still in existence. These three operations are still in existence. They are multi-million-dollar businesses now. And as I said, I came on as as an organizer and an assistant manager of the loan company, and in a year's time, I became the general manager of Southern Consumers Cooperative. And now I'm taking you up till about 1967. I finished college in 62, taught for 2 years or 2.5 years, left that experience and went full-time with Southern Consumers Cooperative. From 1959, well, from 1954 until I came on full-time with Southern Consumers, I worked with McKnight, in the outreach efforts in the rural communities around Lafayette in adult literacy and credit union development.
What was the atmosphere around there at that point, and what was the response, both the kind of the elites to what you were doing, and the people that you were trying to organize?
In the beginning, they didn't know what we were doing, because these things were held in people's homes and in churches and places like that. We had a relationship. We also had a couple of civil rights organizations in the community, in the rural community. In St. Landry Parish, CORE was there. And we had a strong NAACP chapter that we all belonged to, but people in all of those civil rights organizations, there was always a group of people who were certainly interested in voter education and in integration of public accommodations and things of that sort, and the right to vote. But there were also folks in all of your civil rights organizations who were interested in economic development. And some of them placed their energies in those areas. Some of the people who worked for Southern Consumers came from, a few of them, one or two of them might have come from CORE and places like that. But and I'll get back to the reason and the basis for starting the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. But the early staff of the Federation of Cooperatives, and there are a few still around, were from the civil rights organizations who had spent their time community organizing for business and community economic development activities. Now, as Southern Consumers start growing and becoming more visible and became employing more people, then the attacks started. The attacks on us as communists and as subversives and as misusers of external grant monies from the government and from foundations and things of that sort. And I think it was in 1966, we were investigated locally. The Southern Consumers was investigated locally. They raided our office and took off with seized our books and brought us into court to defend ourselves. Against that. Of course, this whole thing didn't amount to too much because there was no misuse of resources, and so we were vindicated by that. But we had to bring in lawyers from the NAACP and from up north and whatnot to help defend us. And I think that frightened them, because heretofore, you didn't have that kind of legal challenge to the establishment that we were able to put into place. But we the operations themselves were soundly structured and with strong fiscal protections, and so and most of the people were highly motivated people and whatnot who were getting much more satisfaction from being involved in something that was worthwhile and that would benefit people. And it seemed to relate it to the currents within the black community who were working towards liberation and improving the circumstances of black people. And being able to relate to this groundswell of activities within the black community, was sufficient for us. it took little for us to survive, and you know, but we survived on the small salaries that we received, even those of us who had families by then. And folks, I mean, I'm certain some folks in time might have done something inappropriate, but not within our organization in those particular years, in those years.
But these building on kind of traditional forms of cooperation and kind of self-help in the black community.
Oh, yeah.
And were you able to plug in like burial societies and lodge credit arrangements and stuff into this, or did you try to? Some
of the same people who had been involved in your benevolent organizations in the communities were among the initial and original activists who became part of this cooperative economic efforts and whatnot, and it brought to it some skills that were very useful to the organization and whatnot. Some of them didn't want to touch it because they felt threatened to some extent by the status that they had gained in the community, and they were very traditional and conservative, and it didn't originate with them, and they didn't want to be second or third, maintaining their own businesses and efforts, you know, offer them a greater degree of affirmation and status than coming into something that was already started and whatnot. We didn't get a great deal of resistance from them or opposition or harmful opposition. They just didn't participate, in that. But it was interesting. It was interesting how in the late 50s you had things similar to what was happening in Southwest Louisiana happening in other communities in the South, especially your rural communities that had the benefit of work done by the more traditional civil rights organization. There were those kinds of community economic development activities and cooperative business development activities happening in Mississippi, in Tennessee, in Georgia, South Carolina, Kentucky, North Carolina, you know, in that particular time. Yeah. And, you know, and I would say much of it was a result of the leadership of your traditional civil rights organization, and who came from the North and who had encouraged indigenous leadership to start thinking more along those lines about doing things in a more self-determinative way, and in the area of in areas that went beyond voter registration and integration or public accommodation. Not so much as separatists as, you know, just convincing people that there was something that they had to do on their own, you know, to change their circumstances, and there were limitations to what the government could do or would do, given what circumstances were. And you know, but those types of things were occurring at this particular time that infrequently get the play that the boycotting and the other kinds of demonstrations receive.
Well, I think that there's a kind of cooperative tradition, even among rural blacks in the South, that extends back even further. It's gone pretty unnoticed. I mean,
That's right.
When we were starting to do some research on this, I was amazed at little books and articles and pamphlets I would find on cooperative movements in eastern North Carolina.
That's right. That's right.
In the 1920s and 30s among black farmers.
That's right.
I mean, you know, somebody did a little study or made some list of.
Well, in Arkansas, where Ali Neal and those folks are from, you know, they had a strong cooperative movement in around the turn of the century. That's still in existence. I don't know how structured it is, but I remember in '67 there were some members that worked with us in the federation, you know, who were from that community. Dr. Du Bois, in one of his books, I think it's Dust of Dawn, I'm not certain, but he was one of the first advocates of cooperative economics too. And here and there in other of his publications, he mentioned that as a means towards achieving economic fulfillment and transformation of black people. That type of approach. Folks did it informally, and in many instances, especially those who were moving westward, and who had seemingly as great an emergency to band together in this foreign environment that they were moving to, and survive through that type of informal cooperation. You know, purchasing in bulk and selling in bulk to realize the economies of scales involved in those kinds of activities. But and it just makes so much sense. If a community is experiencing common problems, it just seems, and with little resources, it just seems as if, you know, to us, it made so much sense to pool resources and use them to satisfy a common need. And, you know, that's the thing that really got me, and it just made so much sense to me, that type of approach, and still means, makes so much sense to me.
How would you describe the economic circumstances of the people that you were trying to work with at that point? One of the things I'm trying to do is get some sense of how things have changed over time, or some of the impact that various programs and projects and things.
Most of the folks that we worked with were, extremely poor and subsistent farmers, or if they lived in rural communities, and if they did not, if they were not engaged directly in agricultural cash crop activities, they were doing odd jobs and seasonal work, odd jobs in the nearby county seat, or domestic work, and they were renting their land in most cases and growing part of their food needs in garden plots and things of that sort. Most of the people, I would say, over 80% of the folks were poor and subsistent rural residents. You know, poor housing, often no plumbing, minimum education, formal education, experiential education is much different. But anyhow, no formal education, poor health services, and many of them were somewhat emaciated by health circumstances, poor health, lingering health problems and whatnot. But, you know, despite all of that, there was this new enthusiasm that had enlivened folks and had given them hope for an optimism and a new sense of their own worth and value that was amazing at the time, you know, and folks did amazing things in that period. Many of the businesses were small, cooperatives were small businesses and whatnot, but folks were attempting to sustain themselves and learn how to run their own businesses at the same time, and their days were long days. And a goodly number of them learned management skills sufficient enough to run their own businesses with hardly an elementary school education. They became wise policymakers because they ran their own business, had to make the policy, and they had to hold management accountable to those decisions and whatnot. And they became very effective and efficient policymakers. Again, you know, re-emphasizing and redefining for them that sense of wealth. You know, each accomplishment brought a greater sense of self-confidence with them and whatnot. And you could see those kinds of, you could see the differences in the way they communicated to you, the way they related to their families, the more encouragement they gave to their children, you know, in terms of higher education and things of that sort. You know, I think the community efforts that we had, be it in with the emphasis on cooperative development or other community enterprising efforts, you know, like were worthy efforts. I still don't understand the inclination on the part of certain institutions, you know, to discourage that, because the more people you have involved in improving their own conditions, the more you, in these kinds of activities, which are constructive activities, the more the society as a whole benefits from that, because, you know, you encourage innovation and talents to express themselves and all of that, and folks are not thinking in terms of more destructive things in the community, and the less destructive things you have locally, the less destructiveness you have for the society as a whole. But it seems as if, you know, because it was counter to normative, traditional, I guess I forget the point that I was making.
You mentioned on the phone yesterday maybe about...
Oh, yeah. You know, sometimes we hear folks say, and we read in different kinds of publications, and we used to hear it from foundations all the time, and some government agencies, oh, we can't support cooperatives because it's a proven thing that they cannot work. They have failed. Well, you know, that position is very interesting because there's no proof behind it. And during the Depression, you had the beginnings of a strong cooperative movement in this society in the United States. And the difference with that particular effort and our effort was that it was a white effort and this one was a black effort. You had the institutional support behind the cooperative movement in the South, as well as, especially in the Midwest. The national government as well as the state government support, and all your other community institutions were supportive of that particular effort, and it succeeded. We didn't have that. I mean, we had resistance from institutional resistance at all levels and whatnot. You know, and we could not raise the necessary resources to do fully the conditioning and the training within our own people. So, you know, the variables that was necessary to effectively execute this kind of program was never brought together in sufficient amounts to test the validity of this type of enterprising. So if failure, and as I was mentioning before, it's not so much that the cooperative economic enterprise development effort failed on its own merit. It failed what failed was the inability to mobilize the necessary resources to prove the thesis that we were advancing. Some have succeeded, and if you look at those that have succeeded, or even those that are just lingering and still trying to mobilize resources, you'll see the proof, the validity in this position that I'm mentioning right now. Somehow they were able to escape that resistance or transcend that resistance and bring together those variables: the technology, the capital that was necessary, and the marketing that was usually necessary too.
Well, I think there's one thing that this kind of this ability of people to help themselves and to grow and to kind of create this dynamism that you're talking about is, I think, in some ways for groups of people in power who are used to running things, that's something that they're the most fearful about.
Yeah.
It's the thing that they fear more than anything else, is that people actually have the ability to do things
independently,
and to organize things and to run things themselves.
Right. It is threatening too, because if you used to a certain kind of community rhythm, where you are the superordinate actor, and there are these subordinates, that you can control and manipulate. Then, when folks start saying, no, we're going to do it another way, and yeah, we're interested in politics, and maybe we'll start voting or demanding our right to vote, and once we get the right to vote, we might start offering ourselves, once you ignite the fervor is ignited in people, folks themselves make decisions about what it is they want to do and what activities they want to be involved in. Of course, we were blamed for encouraging electoral participation and partisan participation and running people for office and things of that sort, but we were a non-profit, tax-exempt organization. We knew we couldn't be involved directly in those kinds of things. But what folks did what folks did in their own private lives is their business, and whatnot. But it's, we didn't encourage those things directly.
Well, I think that's the problem. I mean, you look at the labor, with the trade union movement in the South and different places among black workers, the period of 40s and 50s, that's studied a lot. And it's the same thing, it's even, employers felt, I think at times, that they could contain it, so all it was a union or factory or something. There was some rationalization for that. I mean, you could actually, it may have been even more efficient to deal with absenteeism and certain kinds of disciplines. But there was always, there was a cancer. It was always going to spread.
That's right. That's right. I remember once the Federation was really moving along and getting a considerable amount of support externally as well as internally, and we were doing things that required trading with the local white businessmen and things of that sort. And initially, when we started running these programs and they understood what was happening and they had no control over the funding process and whatnot, there was this reaction and effort to resist this through the congressional delegations in those various states and whatnot. But they were not successful, and they soon came to realize that the more money monies that were brought in the community, the more advantaged they would become because of this, because they were the ones that owned the goods and services in the community, the businesses and whatnot, and their businesses began to grow. And as their businesses began to grow, there was less resistance on their part. There were still some elements in the community that wanted control and maintain a level of resistance to most of the communities in which we worked. But in time, we reached a certain kind of tenuous rapprochement with some of the white community folks and business people, not in all of the communities, because even through the 80s, we were getting a lot of resistance. In fact, in 1980, the Federation had its big investigation. Almost destroyed the organization and what have you. But like in 1964, for a year or two, I guess, prior to 1964, these local groups that were engaged in community economic development, cooperative economic development, soon came to realize that in order to accelerate this type of development, they would have to try to attract resources from the external world, externally, and began making demands on your civil rights organizations and the context that the civil rights organizations had with the philanthropic sector. And we started directing our attention to organizations like the Southern Regional Council, National Sharecroppers Fund, the Friends, and Field Foundation, and other foundations, New York and Normandy Foundation. They didn't know what to do, and because this was a new thing to them. This is new to Southern Regional Council. they succeeded in, what they decided to do was to give Southern Regional Council a little money, some of these foundations, to convene a meeting of all of these groups that were talking about community economic development, especially cooperative economic development. Well, there were a series of meetings that were held. Those that were, regional meetings were held with those groups that were specifically involved in cooperative economic development. Southern Regional Council and the National Sharecroppers Fund helped to convene those for us. Out of those meetings, which lasted for about a year or so, came the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. The groups made the decision that the best way to solve some of those needs that each organization, that they established there was a common set of needs that each local group had. The need for more management skills, the need for capital, for development and expansion, operational monies, and training, other forms of training, board of directors training, management training, technical training, and skills training for the membership. Because the agricultural cooperative membership was talking about moving away from row crops since they could not survive in the small acreages that they had and could not buy the technology they needed for renting more land and what have you, or couldn't rent the land because they didn't have the money. They wanted to use the little resources that land resources that they could rent, or the few who owned land wanted to maximize production and the use of those limited resources they had. So they were thinking more of diversifying their agricultural activities. But although they had basic agricultural cultural practices, they need more specialized cultural practices, so the farmers needed additional training. So these common set of needs, were grouped together, and the decision was made that the best way to deal with satisfying those needs was to create an umbrella organization for the fostering of cooperatives and attending to the needs that the cooperatives had. Essentially, to explain generally, that's what the purpose of the Federation, or the mission of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives is all about. So we met for another 6 months to a year or so, hammering out a charter for defining the organization and developing a charter and the bylaws. The people themselves from the cooperatives did all of that. Southern Regional Council helped us to secure a lawyer from South Carolina, Fred LeClaire, a white lawyer, who was involved in the civil rights movement and was sold on cooperative economic development. And I think Southern Regional Council, or one of the organizations, gave him a small stipend to underwrite his expenses. He filed our charter for us in our tax-exempt charter in 1966, and a few months afterwards, in March of 1967, we were chartered as the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. In the meantime, we had developed a acting board of directors, a representative from 22 of the cooperatives that were actively meeting. And I was selected as the chairman of that board of directors. I was then manager or general manager of Southern Consumers Cooperative. So I saw
attending the meetings on behalf of
the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. Well, I was representing our credit union, I think, or the loan company. It was 22 persons representing 9 cooperatives, really, because several of the groups had multiple of cooperatives within the same organization. Like we had Southern Consumers, the loan company, another agricultural cooperative that was very closely related to us, a few miles from Lafayette. And in Alabama, Lewis Black and his wife and a few other folks had about 4 or 5 other cooperatives too. So it was really about 9 people, 9 or 10 cooperatives being represented by 22 people. And they selected me to serve as the chairman of the board. And once we were chartered, in March, it was my responsibility with a search committee to find someone to direct the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And believe it or not, I was satisfied with working with Southern Consumers in Lafayette, and I had no interest in the job. I wanted to serve on the board and not necessarily as the chairman of the board. And Al Ulmer, who was working with Southern Regional Council at the time, I don't know if you ever heard of him.
the name before,
He would be a good man to talk to.
That's what somebody was telling me.
Al Ulmer ex-Peace Corps. He was in the Peace Corps, and his wife was in the Peace Corps, and they got married and all of that, you know. Al is a Southerner from Florida, and he worked with Southern Regional Council, and he was heading up a project for them, and he sort of worked with this effort, the organizing of the meetings for the cooperatives in the region, and finding places for us to meet, and helping raise money for our travel expenses and things of that sort. So he and John Lewis, John had left SNCC, and he was working at Field, and Al was leaving the project, and Al convinced him to take the job. So we commissioned them to visit all of the cooperatives and find someone, because I was unsuccessful, you know, and they could spend full time doing that. So they said, well, we'll help you, Charles. And they went to Florida and South Carolina and everywhere else where we had Mississippi and Arkansas, Tennessee, all the cooperatives, Kentucky. Couldn't find anyone, and they ended up in Lafayette, Louisiana. And gave me the report and said, Charles, we can't find anybody, so we're here to urge you to take the job temporarily, you know, and just get the thing started. The big problem, the big reason why they couldn't find anyone, because the organization had no money. I mean, they didn't have a dime. Field Foundation and Norman and New York promised to give us a little money that amounted to, I think, $12,000 or $13,000, you know, something like that. We hadn't gotten it yet. And no one, we thought we had somebody from a cooperative in West Georgia. I forget what's the name of the cooperative there. West Georgia Farmers Cooperative. And the guy made a commitment to come on board. That was before Al, and he made a commitment to me. The time to take the job, he called the day before and said the people wouldn't let him leave. But I think he learned that we didn't have any money to pay him. Now, that's when Al and John went on their tour. So at that time, I was running for office in Southwest Louisiana. I was running for, we don't call them county commissioners there, we call them police jurors. So I was running because it was time for blacks to run for office, and no one wanted to run, and so I decided to run. I and another guy ran for office just to open the way for folks. We lost, needless to say, but it did serve the purpose. So after my election in November, they returned and started talking to me again about coming. So, you know, I met with the Federation's membership, and they were saying the same thing. And apparently I had done a good job up to this point as the chair of the organization, and they had confidence in my ability, in my abilities, and so they urged me at a fall meeting in Montgomery to take the job, and I did take it, and came on board January 1, 1968. No money. 2 children. One wasn't a year old yet, and the other one was 17 months, I think, or 18 months. And a wife. I left in Louisiana and came to Atlanta. No place to stay. Al put me up for a little while, and I didn't really get a place to stay until April. And I brought my family down. We didn't have a place to stay. We stayed with some Vista volunteers. But took the job. Phil found the monies finally came in, and opened a small office, and within a month's time, I had more demands for financial assistance in the office than I had money to run the office and to pay my salary, and half of which I, you know, gave. Well, the board instructed me to make loans to these cooperatives, so half of which $7,000 or $8,000 we made out in loans and grants to the cooperatives, and didn't know how I was going to be able to pay the office expenses and the equipment, a few pieces of equipment that we bought, not to talk about the salary, you know. But we managed some kind of way. And from January 1, 8 months later, in August, in the meantime, we applied for resources. You know, we wrote up a proposal and sent it to OEO, and we lucked off. In August, we received a large grant from the Office of Economic Development then. and that really was the takeoff point for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives.
What were your, maybe you could just give me a sense, I mean, I can find some of this, you know, but just maybe some of your reminiscences about maybe describing or telling me a little bit about a few of the co-ops that were members of the Federation.
Okay.
You know, some of the individuals that kind of stand out as kind of as exemplary leaders or visionaries or.
There were a number of people. I think all of the founders were outstanding people. I'm going to mention the first person I'm going to mention is a person named Lewis Black. He's from Hale County, Alabama, and he and his wife name is Mildred. And in Hale County, which is a black belt county, Lewis Black and his wife were school teachers at one time. He was a band director, and she taught in, I don't know if it was elementary or high school. They were involved with SCLC and very active in the community. And they had 3 girls, but they were nonetheless school teachers, supposed to be very, you know, conservative and all that, but they were really hot shots. And they were fired from their jobs because of their civil rights activities in the Black Belt of Alabama. So they decided to start these little grocery stores. They started a grocery store cooperative, a credit union cooperative, and eventually a sewing cooperative. And so they spent that time full-time trying to organize these kinds of things. Whatever money they made through you know, consulting work with other groups, they plowed back into the organization. Lewis Black was on worked for the Federation of Southern Cooperatives at one time, and until he left the Federation 5 years ago, 6 years ago, whatever, you know, he did the same. He used his money, whatever monies he made, he plowed back into the organization. He's the most selfless person that I've ever met. And because of that involvement, he and his wife, who are reaching Social Security now, but they're still more poor now than they were when they were school teachers and before their activities began. Spoke to him just a few days ago, and he's trying to figure out a way to pay his light bills, you know. And but he's still optimistic. He was telling me the other day. He's still involved in the community to some extent. He's angry at some community people and some organizations because he thought that you know, he should have gotten more support. Even during hard times, he should have gotten more support and some indication that of affirmation that he made a contribution, and he still is a valuable person. But knowing Lewis Black, you know, that's just a temporary thing. I just think I caught him at a low spot. There was another guy that I really admire a great deal, too, equally as much as Lewis Black. His name was Mr. Shockley. He was the oldest member of the founders of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives from a co-op in Tennessee, Mid-South was the name of it, in Whiteville, Tennessee. And, you know, he was the voice of wisdom, the voice of moderation, and, you know, he was very much in place with us youngsters, you know, because I was relatively young in those days. In fact, I was in my early 20s when I first started with the work with organizing the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. Mid-20s, I guess 24 or 25, and I was 26 when I took the job with the Federation. But, you know, he felt very much in place with us and respected us, and we respected him. But his ideas were so contemporary that, you know, we found ourselves in very compatible. And he had spent all of his life working in that community in betterment activities in the NAACP and in the benevolent community. And he was one of the ones that came over, you know, and he did have some skills, and gave me a great deal of support. And I think he was the one that nominated me for the presidency or the chairmanship of the board of directors. He's died, and his manager, a guy named Mr. Johnson who died about a year after the Federation was organized and operating out of Atlanta and whatnot. And that was Mrs. Witherspoon and her husband from Gee's Bend, Alabama, with the Freedom Quilting Bee Cooperative. Y'all probably heard of her. A lady with very little formal education, became the manager of that cooperative and sustained that cooperative for the last 25, 26 years or so. She just retired. But she and her husband were, you know, active in Southern Christian, SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and CORE, and SNCC. Well, SNCC was in the Black Belt, and they worked with SNCC field workers in that community, fed them and housed them, and participated in their rallies, and were involved in the demonstrations and the drive for voting rights and things of that sort, and were active with the King movement and the Montgomery bus boycott movement and what have you. Gave support to that effort in Montgomery County. They were all sort of shared an affinity, that whole Black Belt. So I would say Mrs. Witherspoon, and just her enthusiasm and her interest in learning business principles and marketing principles and supervision and whatnot, and the way she was able to develop those skills and to maintain that cooperative is a good story in and of itself, of the will of people to be human beings. There was a guy from Florida who was a founder also. His name was Guy Long. I think also an ex-school teacher who was dismissed because of his civil rights activities. Started a credit union there, and that
seems to happen a lot. John Brown was another.
John Brown, yeah, John was fired.
Resigned or was fired from his job for the same stuff.
Right. Guy, I think about 10 years ago, a guy died from, I think, a stroke or something, but he would have been. Lewis Black is now in his, about 66 years old, and his wife is a few years younger. Mrs. Witherspoon is probably in her early 70s right now. Mr. Shockley was 75 or 80 years old, so he's died. There was a white guy named Reverend Fulton from Kentucky who's working with a group of small farmers in the around Henderson, North Carolina. That was the founder, and you know, he made a tremendous contribution to the organization too, and helped us with our appreciation for the common needs that cut across racial lines and whatnot. And so we always had an integrated effort. With majority of the members were black, but nonetheless we always had involvement on the part of folks in Appalachia and in South Texas with the Hispanics in South Texas. He, you know, he brought some interesting ideas and enthusiasm to the organization, and I thought he was courageous to sit through some of the meetings with all of this radical rhetoric that was used in not just the initial meetings with the activism and the rhetoric of the militant core and SNCC elements in our organization.
What was your, as you're involved in this particular organization, you're also maintaining ties with other civil rights groups, or, you know, participating in the same activities. How did you see yourself doing something different, having a kind of a different kind of vision? How did you see yourself in relation to the kind of larger activism of that era?
Well, I thought that I still think that protest politics is important, and you know, it's necessary to keep people's feet to the fire, especially when you have inequality in existence and whatnot. But you know, like protest politics has its limitations, and I don't think you could convince people to transform the economic lives of people through moralizing and protesting and whatnot. You have to develop certain kinds of concrete models and activities that are of a transitive nature that can transform, a constructive transitive nature and whatnot that can be utilized to transform people's lives and whatnot. You just cannot shame people into starting those kinds of activities for other folks and whatnot.
Yeah.
You have to do this for yourselves and whatnot.
Yeah.
My view of the other activism or activities occurring along the lines of integrating public accommodation and the quest for the ballot and whatnot, and protesting other kinds of inequalities and whatnot, all necessary activities, and all within the context of changing things and what have you. I thought that those things were needed, and there was a division of labor that had to be defined, and we had taken one slice of the division of labor, but all of these things were interrelated. And it wasn't, in my view, a competitiveness. The job was so great and so complex and whatnot, you needed different people doing different things. In fact, my problem was against inbreeding. I thought that you could, the law of diminishing return applies in situations in which you have the same people doing the same thing and whatnot, what have you. So you have to spread it out, and you have to divide the labor and make the application accordingly and whatnot. And so I viewed our activities in that light, and some of our people had their hands in different activities and whatnot, but I pretty much concentrated all my energies with the Federation, and gave the kind of support that I thought we could give to the other organization. I volunteered it and made it available upon demand. In fact, few people know that about 5 months, let's see, when was it? Less than that. A few months before Dr. King was killed, Lewis Black and I left a meeting in Demopolis, Alabama, Marengo County, Alabama, part of the Black Belt area. When word had been given to us that Dr. King was interested in economic development, and he had heard about the cooperatives and whatnot, and he wanted to talk to us, we left a meeting around 10 o'clock one night in Marengo County, drove to Mr. Black's house in Hale County to get some change of clothes for him. I was in Atlanta, so I would get some there. Drove all night to Atlanta to meet Dr. King after his first services at Ebenezer Baptist Church to talk to him about this. He was in the midst of his plans for the Poor People's Campaign. And after the campaign, he wanted to, move into more specific kinds of things and whatnot. So we had our discussion with him, and we had reached a gentleman's agreement to work together. He knew what we were doing, and we reiterated some of those things in our philosophy and defended our position for this type of community involvement. And I thought we had persuaded him to do that. We had a few more conversations with him and whatnot, but we couldn't follow through on it because he was assassinated the following, what was it, April? April, in April.
Yeah.
So, there was such an upheaval. They went on with the Poor People's Campaign, and we participated in the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, but that was a disaster, that old thing. And there was so much of a upheaval within Southern Christian Leadership Conference that, we couldn't make heads or tail. There was competition for leadership. Abernathy is a good man and all that, but, he had his hands full to try to retain the control of the organization. And so my board of directors took the position that, when they're ready, we'll get together. And we never were able to do it. But I was really excited about that possibility, because we find ourselves, in the same kinds of community, and their staff was in some of the same counties where we were and whatnot, and we were doing things in an unofficial way together, but he wanted to formalize it more and to put it in his national effort for support, what have you, and to infuse his whole operation with that possibility for cooperative economic development. We were not entirely against the other type of business development that was occurring in some of those communities, especially the urban communities, but in some rural communities, like in the Mace area. We just were not there philosophically or ideologically. We were not convinced that single proprietorships, encouraging that type of activity, was the way to go. We thought we could satisfy, do the greater good for the greater number of people through the use of the cooperative economic structure and whatever.
The needs. I mean, one of the things. Well, 2 points I want to make. Think about it. It does seem to me, one, that y'all are getting kind of at what people in S. King and other people in SDLC come to a little bit later as in recognizing the central kind of importance of economic self-sufficiency or some degree of economic control for political and social power, and that the kinds of moves, the kinds of organizations, the kinds of structural things that you're doing 3, 4, 5 years earlier is the direction the movement goes.
That's right.
And it keeps going.
That's right.
Despite death and all these other things, that's where.
That's right. There's still a movement.
That's where things.
Whether or not it's the NAACP Fair Share Program or Jesse Jackson Shake the Tree kind of thing, or the Urban League's Domestic Marshall Plan thing, folks are still talking about that. I remember still in high school one summer in one of our adult literacy classes, some husband in a family raised his hand up and said, "Look, I know how important it is, the 3 R's are, but tell me how that's going to put more red beans and rice in my table." So, a whole discussion resulted in that profound statement on his part. He said, "Look, I have a family. I know it's important to learn to become literate, and all that kind of stuff. But he said, I need to be able to find a job that will give me sufficient income to take care of these babies, And so I think that's what our focus should be. And I think that's when our emphasis really change from, the long-term possibilities that can ensue from that type of adult activity for adults, then to a more direct focus on the here and now needs of the folks and what they were saying and whatnot. And we came to realize that we were superimposing down on them an idea that we thought was valuable and important and necessary for them. And pretty much the man told us, this is not what we want, this is what we want. So we changed our whole way of looking at community needs from that point on. And I think you see that type of evolution occurring within all of your civil rights organizations. SNCC and CORE were involved eventually into more economic enterprising activities, especially in Mississippi. They had a strong, what do they call them, Poor People's Cooperative and Liberty House and Jesse Morris and those folks over there. And they had units, handicraft units spread throughout the states.
Well, I certainly think the more the civil rights movement becomes, or the less the civil rights movement becomes urban-oriented and middle-class focused, and focused on the franchise or certain kinds of things. And the more it brings in, people on the land, people who have really fairly dire economic needs, then that has a tremendous. I don't know if people ever talk. Very few people, when they write about the civil rights movement, ever talk of. It's always a transformation in the heads and the conceptualizations of the leadership. I think they very rarely look at how the membership and the mobilization of certain groups through, by the mid to late 60s, has a very, I think, I mean, I don't even have to look at this more closely, has a fairly profound impact on the kinds of issues that people in the movement are taking up.
Yeah.
I don't think people
realize.
It's still a leadership.
That's right.
King made this decision to move this direction.
Right.
And I don't.
No, they don't. Right.
That's not where the
That's right. And
impulse is coming from.
that's right. That's right. And folks misinterpret the Montgomery bus boycott, and the bottoms-up sort of groundswell that took place in that particular movement, and guided King in the direction that he took. Now, King after that took off on his own, but even that particular movement itself, was a grassroots movement. Nixon and those folks, Reverend Nixon and them, they were involved in that, but it was the people themselves saying, no, we're not going to march. I mean, not going to ride the buses, we're going to stay away from it, and we're going to organize ourselves. I mean, King pretty much took direction. You read, what is it, Part in the Waters? Pretty much, what's that? Taylor Branch, Taylor Branch pretty much brings that out, which is a well-written, well-researched rendition of that effort and whatnot. But you had the same thing. King's failure in Albany was because there was not consonance between the interests of SCLC and the local interests there. They could just never get together on that kind of thing. And the local folks view them as fly-by-nights coming in and then making good speeches and leaving and all of that. Folks were saying some other things, the basic things that need to be done. Well, you also had that competition between SCLC and SNCC there, and then you had the other more indigenous efforts. The local members of the NAACP. I forget the name of the minister, but that's a very good point. I think like oftentimes when folks look at a certain movement type of activity. They look at an individual because it's easy to identify the individual as leader and not the community as the leadership in that environment and whatnot, and the contribution that they make oftentimes in pushing someone out there to represent them. I thought that, and there are a lot of stories like that that are still unwritten. I think Carson seems to be getting at it, and I hope others who follow him in that type of research effort will realize that the value of his contribution towards this end. It's not that, I was talking to Leslie or somebody not so long ago, it's not that, all virtue resides, only poor people have virtue. Right. That's not the point, and people are people. You have virtue in the rich as well as in the poor. But, like I think when folks are sufficiently tired and sufficiently determined and whatnot, you have the makings of a tremendous possibility, for change in their lives and in their community's life. And, I still think that what happened in the contemporary civil rights movement is an incomplete event that has just somehow been arrested or intervened, but it will continue on. I think it's still in a transitional stage, and the leadership, the community leadership, is trying to redefine itself in terms of the tenets of the new egalitarian, contemporary egalitarianism right now. And I don't know if I'm just dreaming right now, but I think that you don't have that redefinition of betterment leadership, even at the national level. You have your traditional national organizations saying the same things. They have not taken stock of the new situation in which we find ourselves. And they don't. And they must also come to grips with the fact that there are limitations in any policy or any goal to integrate everyone into the an economic system that is incapable of including everyone, And they must think about new, innovative possibilities. in those communities. I don't think the solution is new enterprise zones. But I think you're going to set up the community for the same kind of explosion 10, 12 years down the road. A way has to be found to enable the community itself. To enable the community itself, certainly to attract income, but to use those incomes within the community itself to improve the quality of that particular environment. But if you're just going to set up on, so like we have to find a way to enable communities as a community to improve the community and create situations in which the community can control the goods and services and the movement of income from those goods and services in the community. You can't set somebody up in the community to provide a service and that individual take the income out of the community and spend it somewhere else. It does nothing for the community.
Right.
And so,
well, it's just, it's so obvious in this country that, the system, the way it works, even at its best, as they claim was moving in the 1980s, they're huge, the
national leadership, business leadership, and political leadership are Cold War leaders and whatnot, and so they were socialized or conditioned in a certain way, and that's no longer the requisite for leadership. And like the point Lorna Borg made, you have to look at things in a different way too, given the type of globalization tendencies that you do have in the economy, and translate its implications for us domestically and whatnot. But I just think that there's so much work that needs to be done during this particular period, and it's a challenging period too.
Yeah.
Thank God that some of your social scientists are now looking at are more courageous than they were in the past, and then looking at the institutions of the society and those variables that operate within those institutions that and try to explain how they impact social reality. And I think they're raising questions about the sacrosanct economic institution that we had, and they're challenging those assumptions that were never challenged before.
No, that's right.
And I'm optimistic about that trend. I don't know how long it's going to last, but I would hope that it would continue in this way, because it just doesn't make sense to hope to change destitution by blaming the people who are destitute for their own causes. If they were given a choice, no wise or sensible person would choose to live in that kind of state. And it just seems so simplistic and stupid to present that kind of conclusion or generalization, in civil discussions.
Yeah, right. I'm interested in a comparison. You talked a little bit about that in the cooperative movement, or thinking cooperatively about community enterprises and structures, that you weren't in favor of. The single proprietorship, just people starting small businesses, didn't seem to be the most kind of constructive way of mobilizing community resources and getting people involved. Yet, so many of the skills and the talents and the kind of drive that it takes to make a cooperative successful are the same kinds of skills and talents and understandings that make a small business successful.
Right.
And maybe you could just talk about what the tension is there, or what we.
No, I think you misunderstood. The encouragement of small businesses, individualistic businesses, for the the nature of a single proprietor and whatnot is good in and of itself. And I think there should be room in any scheme of community business development for that type of activity. To propose that as a solution for the entire community does not seem to sit well with me, you know. Does not seem to be a logical solution to a community problem by saying that you're going to allow a handful of entrepreneurs to engage in single proprietorship and call that community economic development. No, the skills that are necessary to run a small business are certainly transferable to any type of sound enterprise and what have you. There is no difference. Entrepreneurship, be it at the partnership level or the single proprietorship level, it's the same as entrepreneurship within the framework of a cooperative and whatnot. It's still same kinds of practices and skills that are needed and whatnot. You know, when you talk about there is a difference in terms of goals of the two organizations, and maybe we're splitting hairs when we talk about operating cooperative businesses to satisfy a need. When when that's the driving force, then the issue of how you relate to maximizing your resources and whatnot might be slightly different. But you would like to have a return for your energies, the capital and other resources you put into any enterprise greater than what you put in, you know, so that you can expand the operation. The emphasis to emphasize need, again, rather than greed, sits better with me as a philosophical principle and what have you. But I think that, there isn't, I'm not a fanatic. I'm not fanatic to the extent where I'm myopic about individual differences and tendencies within the human person and whatnot. And I would not oppose, and I would, within the cooperative movement, we help individuals to go into business and whatnot. I just think that it is not appropriate to talk in terms of you do that to help the individual, and indirectly, it might have some bearing in the community, but it's not directed specifically to transform the economic circumstances of the community. And you just can go so far with that kind of development, and something else has to take place for the residual numbers of people who need income or need employment in that community. And how much you can multiply the effects, the implications of those type of businesses so they can have benefits for different people and whatnot, I just don't know,
Well, I guess one of the points that I was trying to make was actually that there are, with the exception of this, the kind of basic credo of need versus greed, or kind of profit versus some kind of sharing of resources and everything, that there are certain kind of similarities in that, in some way, the transition, the culture of cooperation, the culture of consumer cooperatives is not as foreign to kind of American way of life and to the way in which we operate, and the way in which the world operates as people make it out to be.
Oh, right.
That the transitions and that the skills and a lot of the things that are necessary to do to run small businesses are the same kinds of skills that if you can get the vision thing, or you get people's sense of who they're working for, what their quest is, or what their larger purpose is,
right,
then that in some ways is something to change to
right. Well, I agree with you. In fact, you could look at it from even a different sort of perspective, but it has the same meaning, or it's just saying the same thing a little differently and what have you. I mean, we have all kinds of people with all kinds of differences and whatnot. And, you know, some people like to wear red dresses. Women like to wear red dresses, maybe some men too, but, and others like blue dresses. Right. And the same, you know, with folks. Within the ideological basis for this country and whatnot, what we call the American creed, you have a number of principles that seem to be in conflict one with the other. The whole notion of individualism versus individual liberty versus the needs of the society, or individualism versus communitarian notions and what have you and whatnot. So property ownership and community well-being, you know, or the commonweal and all of that, which seems to be in conflict and contradict one another and all of that. But I think those principles that are contained within the American creed reflect the sophistication of the human being and whatnot. We have all of those tendencies. We have certain things that we have to do for ourselves, and there are certain things that we would be better to do it in conjunction with other folks and whatnot. So you have communitarianism as well as individualism that's contained within the human person and whatnot, and you have that reflected in different ways in society. And I think, you know, like there is grounds, or there's sufficient basis for allowing all of those tendencies to operate, but, you know, within some type of control fashion. I don't want to say control, but with in moderation. Let me put it that way. Right. And in fact, Leslie and I were just talking about his book, In the Common Interest, you know, and I agreed with him that the government has a certain kinds of constitutional. It has a constitutional responsibility to attend to the common weal, you know, and it also has in the Constitution, the first 8 amendments to the Constitution offer, you know, those basic individual protections, protections for the individual. So, you know, like we have I think what needs to be done is to strike the balance. You know, you got to strike the balance. You cannot let individual quest for greed abuse the requisites for the society as a whole. And I think we see that sometimes in this country. We have to strike that balance. But I guess back to your point, there is ample history in this country to justify or to validate the benefits that can ensue from collective or cooperative arrangements and whatnot, you know, between and among people. So, you know, it's not that foreign. You're right, it's not that foreign. I just don't think we have packaged that well enough.
Well, that was the next point
I don't think we have packaged that well enough and as convincingly as we could have 25 years ago. And I think we would stand a much better chance of doing that now. I think what we had also 25 years ago, a lot of theories that were being proposed in advance about what is the best way to do community development, business development, or economic development and whatnot. During the course of those 25 years or so, some of those theories have been invalidated and some have been validated. And I think we ought to go back to those that were validated and build on them, you know, and cast those out that are just rhetoric and symbolic kinds of things, you know. And so we are in a much better position right now, I think, not only with the history, the 25-year history that we have on our belt, but we have a broader history that we can draw on to see what worked under certain kinds of circumstances and whatnot. And that's what social science is supposed to do, you know. This will work if all of these other things obtain, you know. And, you know, I would like to make that argument of the Ford Foundation again. I thought the Ford Foundation was foolish not to support the Federation and to support some of these other activities. And you know, there is proof now. Some of the things it supported lost millions of dollars. I know one organization that lost $11 million in loans, you know. Not naming any names, but anyhow.
Well,
I mean, we would not,
yeah.
we might have lost that, but that would have been a whole lot of redeeming benefits. You know, we would have been able to point to a number of people who've been able to get health attention, to graduate from college, and to start some other kinds of businesses. I mean, we would have had any kinds of redeeming value, but to give it to one person to speculate into land or something like that just doesn't make any sense at all, and it has no redeeming value, and it has no benefit for the community as a whole.
Right. No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's one of the things that you know, one of the directions that in terms of this project that we're doing, I mean, it's one of the things that we're finding out, or trying to find out, and it's also, I think, one of the directions I feel us trying to move in with, you know, the help and cooperation of people like yourself is to be able to figure out how to, I mean, packaging is a good word for it in a way, and how to take the benefits, how to take the things that have worked, what we've learned from the last 25 and 30 years of working on a lot of different fronts to try to deal with some of these problems, and making a case for them, making a case for the ones that have been successful, and also have the potential of helping people. And, you know, one of the things that we learned in talking with people at Mount Bayou is in Bolivar County is the in addition we've learned some basic problems they have, but also we kind of got a glimpse, or more than a glimpse, of a comprehensive, more holistic way of approaching problems, and confronting problems and dealing with problems than most people even today are willing to most people understand or are willing to try to devise strategies to deal with. So in some ways we haven't gone very far.
No.
Because we've forgotten many of those important things.
But you know what you have? You have an advantage of sorts in some of the people that have retained sufficient sanity over the course of the last 25 years. That they're relatively young.
Yeah.
L.C. Darcy was a young woman when she started. You know, she's still very young, and she has a lot to offer with the experiential, with the experiences that she has and can draw upon right now. You know, I and other folks, you know, are still, you know, if our health say we'd be relatively young and all that. And so, you know, but the other thing that needs to be done is that you're going to make no headway with government, the bureaucrats, or philanthropy. Of course, I think that whole issue of philanthropy needs to be rethought and redefined and whatnot, because you don't really have pure philanthropy at all. You know, they're extensions of your public relations office of your private sector and all of that. But anyway, I don't want to get off in a tangent right now. But you need people who have those kinds of experiences or insights into community enterprise development or community social development and whatnot. You can't put in your bureaucracy to run these programs, you know, the pointed head Wall Streeters, you know, who don't know that the South even exists, or these rural communities even exist. You know, they've never been out of that parochial setting, you know, business setting or what have you. In philanthropy as well as over there. Then you say, well, there's their money. Hell, you know, once the money is committed to philanthropy, it belongs to philanthropy. Right. You know, and it's illegal, I think, you know, but anyhow, but anyhow, you know, you need folks who have, who are veterans and who are open enough to all kinds of possibilities, and who can measure a proposition, you know, on its merits, you know. You know, if folks come up to you and say 1x plus y will produce this, well, a person ought to be able to tell whether or not x and plus y will produce that, you know, or offer some kind of test situations or experimental situations to see whether or not it can be done and all of that. But to superimpose upon a community these narrow understanding of social reality or social business enterprise development, you know, it was never tested before, and whatnot, just doesn't make sense. I think the other danger and harm that was done to these efforts and whatnot was the conscious, deliberate effort to destroy the leadership. You know, And to destroy that leadership, you leave the community without, a necessary element or variable. And so, pretty soon, you have you find folks despairing and becoming more and more alienated and becoming more destructive, personally and generally, to the community. And I think that if you have a leadership that's organizing people to rob banks, then you certainly got to find a way to apply the law to those types of activities. But if you have a leadership that's involving people in constructive activities and whatnot, you ought to encourage them and whatnot. Even if you don't like the clothes he wears or things of that sort, But if he's necessary for that community and is doing something that proposes some transformational good or benefits in the lives of people in those communities, then you ought to support them. I think there was a misunderstanding too. A lot of things were misunderstood towards since starting with the Whites riots and all of that. I thought that was a temporary thing and just a consequence that needed to be endured for the historical abuse that had been perpetuating and whatnot. That was just a temporary thing, part of the transitioning or transformation that was occurring. And I thought that you had a sufficiently large group of community leaders who were not concerned or involved in those types of activities that you needed to encourage. And, you don't inflict pain for hundreds of years and expect not to have some kind of altercation of that magnitude. Right. But, there is a cost that has to be borne by this nation, and it's a social cost. And I think, you have to factor that into any kind of business proposition, and that is the development of people, the training of people, the improving your human resources and giving them a capacity to do for themselves or letting them learn a capacity to do for themselves. We were criticized because, we emphasized that in our development, and, our bottom line always ended up in the red, and folks say, well, you're not good business people and whatnot. Well, who's going to pay for that cost? We have to train our people to do the job, and it's just part of, as Rostow, the economist would say, it's just pre-takeoff cost. Right. So, but I think a part of the problem, too, was communication. I would never speak to potential funding sources the way I used to, as direct and undiplomatic, and I have more patience now and than I had in the past. I'm not as direct as I was then. But
well, that's the process of learning and growing older. Hold on a second. Let's see where we were. Maybe we can talk a little bit about again some of the early years of the Federation. What was the first grant you got? Was this big grant from OEO?
Right.
What was that for? And what
we had approached the OEO, and as far as my recollection is concerned, we had asked them for monies for organizing, training, and the providing of emergency loans to cooperatives. And the second, and also to complete our plans for the creation of the lending arm to the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And we said that within a year's time we would complete that, and so we would have the training, technical assistance, and organizing arm would be complemented by the lending activity, which would focus mainly on developing loan packages and providing capital and securing other kinds of capital externally, matching capital, debt, and 219. Yeah. Hey, is it possible? Can we smoke in here?
Yeah.
You give me an ash. Oh, okay. Yeah, I'd like one more, Beck. If
I'm fine right now, thanks.
So the first grant we got was for a little over $500,000. So, you know, I had pretty much a one-person operation there for that first 8 months. And when I knew I was gonna get the OEO money, I hired a secretary, and I also had accepted a Vista volunteer who was looking for a place and couldn't find it. He didn't like what he was supposed to be doing in Atlanta, and he wanted to work with me. He's from New Jersey, but a decent young man. So I got him assigned to the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And I spent my time developing the proposal and trying to convince the OEO people to give us the money, and we did convince them. I did convince them, but I also spent time visiting the cooperatives. I visited all of the 22 groups and helped them with an assessment of needs and incorporated those needs within the proposal. And for the board wanted to expand because they said there were other folks writing us, asking us for assistance, and they said it was our responsibility to foster cooperatives, and the more cooperatives we got into the organization, the better and the stronger the organization would grow. And the cross-fertilization of ideas and you know, moving into economic activities would enhance, with a larger base, would enhance the economies of scales that could be realized and what have you. So I did visit all of the 22 cooperatives during that 8 months period, and had developed their need base and incorporated that into the proposal. I also tried to respond to those demands for those $15,000 or $14,000 that we had from it was Aaron Norman, New York, and Field Foundation gave us a grand total of about $15,000 together combined. Les was convinced with the potentials, so he gave a little bit of money for Field. There was a guy named John Hyman, the New York Foundation, and Debbie Reynolds, Debbie something, I forget her last name. Not Debbie Reynolds, that's the...
It's an actress.
Debbie Cole. Debbie Coles. Yeah, Deborah Coles was the director of the Norman Foundation. So it was that initial grant gave us the time to address emergency needs of the cooperatives, open a small office, and to pay my salary and enable us to develop that proposal. And so we did get the grant, and we started hiring staff. We hired field organizers, local field organizers from the indigenous people from the cooperatives. And we hired some more technical staff who had training in business and economics. And, of course, the fiscal people, we had to put that into place.
Yeah.
In fact, we got a person from North Carolina to head up that organization, a lady who worked with George S's program, the North Carolina Fund.
North Carolina Fund.
Yeah. Elaine Gregory, she worked with Nathan Garrett and DeWitt Sullivan, and I don't know if you know those. Nathan is from here. He's a CPA and lawyer, I think, now.
North Carolina Fund, its tentacles reach out into a
Right.
lot of different places.
Right. I mean, you know, at some point in time, most of your organizations will do things together, you know, exchange staff and cooperate on joint efforts. We've done things with SRC and other organizations, in the past. And we've gotten staff members, not necessarily disgruntled staff people, but Southern Regional Council. I talk about the staff from SNCC and CORE, but we got a number of people who, once we got the grant, applied for job openings there. So once the grant was gotten, the staff was hired, and a great deal of training occurred the first 6 months or 8 months of the grant to take these people, some of whom did not have any understanding of cooperative economics. Most of them were decent. Those field organizers, community organizers, were decent, but they didn't know too much about cooperatives. So we spent a great deal of time training them and working on the new proposal for the creation of the Developmental Lending Institution. Also, shortly after we received the first grant, I and a group from Louisiana, along with McKnight was with us, went to Israel for 2 or 3 weeks to look at the kibbutz model and the moshavims, and to look at the whole concept of developmental lending institutions, and the work that they were doing with immigrants from North Africa and other places and whatnot, resettlement efforts on that part, and the organizations of new communities. We were more interested in developmental lending institutions, the institution. How do you take these people and loan them money to start these kibbutz or moshavs and whatnot, and the terms and concessionary arrangements that are involved in that particular concept, because we wanted to model our developmental lending institution in a comparable way. We knew that traditional lending forms, were not applicable to the kinds of folks we were working with, but who had underdevelopment characteristics, and underdeveloped people's characteristics and what have you. And so we went over there to learn those kinds of things, and we learned a great deal. And we pretty much tried to model the loan company or developmental loan company accordingly, from what we learned from the direct experience and the experiences in Israel, and other things that we had read, about these kinds of concepts. We didn't use too much stuff from the World Bank and the IMF and all that. Cooperative League of the United States had some models that they had developed with their work in other countries and whatnot, and we took some ideas from them. We put together this concept and began trying to convince OEO and the Ford Foundation to support it and whatnot. In fact, we had begun some work with the Ford Foundation, and we had gotten a grant from the Ford Foundation to match before we got the money from the loan company, we had gotten a grant from the Ford Foundation to sort of amount equal to that of OEO, so we could bring on additional people and respond to the new growth within the membership, because the growth in the membership accelerated in that first year from 22 to double itself, within a year's time.
And these people, these groups all have needs.
That's right. That's right.
They need services and they
That's
need
right.
training.
That's right.
How did you develop? Did say on this loan program? Did members of the cooperative apply?
Let me just back off a little, because there's one aspect of development within the structure that I missed. There are a number of things occurring concurrently. The raising of money, the training, the Israel trip, and all those other things. We were also working on the structure of the organization. We had, initially it was based on, we had 22 members, and from that membership, the board of directors was selected. Well, it was going to be difficult to proceed along those lines with folks who were writing in, and we were taking in members from all kinds of states and whatnot. in our bylaws, in our charter, we had alluded to the possibility of organizing structurally around the states, creating state associations of cooperatives. The local membership within a state would belong to a state association of cooperatives, and the state associations of cooperative structure would select the members, the individual members of the co-op, of the various cooperatives in the state, would select a board member to serve on the state structure. So you would have a state policy-making structure making decisions for the cooperatives at the local level. Those decisions that could be made at the state level in terms of resource mobilization and training would take place at the state level. Those functions that were more of a national, like our federal government in a sense, were more of a national function in terms of national fundraising and training that cut across state lines and whatnot, or marketing that cut across state lines and whatnot, or loan lending that cut across state lines, or beyond the capacity of the local state association to address. We would assume that responsibility. So we also structured the groups in that fashion. We took the local cooperatives and we organized them into these state associations, and the state associations within a year or two of the Federation's existence began electing the policy-making structure of the national organization, was the Federation of Southern Cooperatives, or the regional organization. Okay, so grants and loan needs were funneled through the state association, and they were addressed either at that level or they were submitted to us at the national level for or the regional level for the regional policy-making body of the organization to address. Any kind of needs, training needs, and loan needs, or grant needs, or marketing needs, or purchasing needs, training needs, skills training, management training, and board of directors training needs. So we had a pretty tight structural arrangement within the organization, and fundraising was guided in that fashion. They came from the local membership to the state association. What the state association membership or board of directors could not handle, or thought they could not handle, is sent to us. And we incorporated those needs in our national plan for fundraising. It didn't always work smoothly. You had some overlapping and some going to the same places, but we worked on many of those kinks, in time. So we got the large grant from OEO, which was followed a year later, I think, by the Ford Foundation money, and shortly thereafter, Ford and OEO joined together in funding the Developmental Lending Institution, and we created the Southern Cooperative Development Fund. And we asked Father McKnight to assume, if he would consider assuming the responsibilities as the president of the Southern Cooperative Development Fund. That is, if the board of directors, if he would be a candidate, if the board of directors would, and if the board of directors would select him, would he assume those responsibilities? And he agreed to do it. So we had, and he didn't want to leave Louisiana, so we said, well, if you take the job and the board selection, you take the job, then we'll set up the office there. That was a big mistake. Because distance sometimes, distance, the geographical district, we're still in Atlanta. And we were still in Atlanta, and we were also, the other thing that we were doing concurrently, we were doing so much training, and it was costing us so much, and offering so much technical assistance, and it was placing such a demand on the regional staff that we thought we needed to find a way to wholesale those kinds of services. And we also felt that it was necessary to create something concrete that the folks could look at and be inspired by, and what have you. So we started looking around for a central facility geographically to the membership, and we found some land along with a local group in Alabama and built our training facilities there. in Epps, Alabama. You know about that operation. Okay. And so we said, well, we'll allow McKnight to stay in Louisiana. And it was okay. The Alabama and the Atlanta operation was okay, and we did have some problems and whatnot, and which necessitated my leaving Atlanta for 2.5 years and moving my family to Alabama to stabilize things there, and we did that. There was a philosophical problem, rupture in the organization, I guess you would call it that. The funding sources, especially with Ford, and Ford came involved with the lending institution especially, they were not convinced that what we were proposing in terms of developmental lending to poor people or underdeveloped people and whatnot was the best way to do things and whatnot. And they thought that the model had to be as traditional as your conventional lending institutions. And I guess some of our differences between Father McKnight and me began to evolve around that, because Ford started threatening us, look, either you take the money on these terms or don't take it at all, And
what did they want to? What specifically was their vision of the way things?
Well, they were concerned about the social costs involved in loaning money, and they were not convinced that the technical assistance and training arm would be able to assume and service those cooperatives sufficiently enough to take care of those social costs without it being an expense on the loan company. They were not convinced that the kinds of concessions that we were offering people, the deferring of interest over a number of years until folks could, the business would assume that point of viability, and they were not convinced that those were the kinds of terms that you ought to offer to folks. But hell, everybody was poor, and they certainly could not assume the same kinds of terms that would be offered at the traditional lending institution. And their argument was, really, what you need is a loan company that would loan money to black people because the traditional lending institution won't loan it to them.
Right.
Just because they're black.
Discriminating against
Yeah, and they wanted something to address that need rather than the more fundamental needs of the membership. Then the other point of disagreement between the Federation and Ford seemed to be in terms of their acceptance of cooperative economics as a viable a mechanism for satisfying employment and other income needs of poor people. They were overwhelmed by the cost of the needs that people were expressing and whatnot. And they didn't think that they could afford to give us enough money to address those needs. Because, we had little less than, by that time, we were 70 or 80 cooperatives representing maybe 15,000 families, and whatnot.
This is about the early 70s sometime.
Yeah. And so they saw this accelerating also, and so that meant, we would be coming back to them year after year, asking for more and more money. So, they started telling us that we needed to also think in terms of selecting the most potentially viable members within the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and supporting them. And doing some other things a little differently too. But I just couldn't see how they had the right, really, to tell people to scale down their needs or to choose or to force the organization to go into that kind of divisive dynamic, to choose which is more viable and to suggest to them that they could identify objective criteria to do that, It's just an impossible situation when you have this element of desperation, asked to maybe support the needs of somebody else who's as desperate as theirs rather than their own, and we had not come into the organization in that in that way. Everybody had legitimate needs, and you know, everybody's efforts would be supported and fought for and everything else. And the board and I really concluded that this was just too divisive a tactic on the part of Ford Foundation for us to entertain. So we ended up telling them to keep that money. And I'm smiling, but that was a very wrenching and decision on our part. Well, you know, our comrade in Louisiana didn't feel that way, and he just felt that, you know, we need to just take the money and go on out with our business, and that, you know, we would be able to work these things out with these people because they're reasonable in time. Well, the majority of the membership just thought a stand should be taken, and we took the stand, and sure enough, Ford and OEO took the money away from us and gave it to that group over there. And, you know...
Gave it to Father McKnight's group, so that had they kind of split off?
They split it off, you know, and whatnot. But I think you need to talk to them about that and look at what's happened to that organization. Everything we said really came true. And the lawn company itself was never able to meet the, there you go, to meet the kinds of needs. The folks could not afford the terms of the loans.
Like the IMF coming in.
That's right. They just couldn't meet it. And a few loans were made to a couple of cooperatives, but the terms were just so stringent that they either were not able to pay it back or were forced into bankruptcy.
Yeah.
And as of today, the loan company has turned in more to a traditional lending institution, providing some assistance to some entrepreneurs, or spending a considerable amount of time in speculative ventures that have failed. And I guess you can put the two, the thing that I said earlier, and that lost a considerable amount of money with no redeeming value, and spent a considerable amount of that time managing their portfolio. And they've been able to accumulate the monies into the loan company, but not for the original purpose that the organization was founded. And I could say this freely right now because it's you could uncover any of that information yourself. But, you know, I think it's a learning experience. If there's any redeeming value of it, we need to look at it very objectively and critically, and look at the mistakes of the Federation and continue on where we left off with these organizations. I think what happened was natural. There's a lot of emotionalism. There's a lot of paranoia at times. You're forced to compete for resources externally, which is unnatural in the sense because the organization should attempt to mobilize as much resources internally as possible and proceed with certain activities to the extent that it can raise those resources internally and all of that. But as I mentioned earlier, we were trying to accelerate that process and to keep our people involved by raising the resources and showing some successes to them too, to encourage to encourage the self-confidence that was needed and everything else. You know, I don't think we could do development in our communities without any external assistance. If I had it to do over, I would emphasize and find different ways to generate more internal resources. I would push more for that than I pushed in the past. I think that was one of the failures that are mine.
What could those be?
Anything, you know. I would selling lunches and holding raffles or doing anything that would raise some monies from that membership, you know, for the services that they were getting.
You know, Lorna and Ann had a bingo ran a big bingo game for
Yeah.
years.
Yeah, something like that. I would have pushed that more.
They did a lot of good work with money from that bingo.
You're right. And, we did have a nominal amount of money that each member paid, but nothing near to underwrite the cost of services to them. But I think I would do that a little differently. And I would have fought the board more as far as their unwillingness to push that to the extent that they did.
Was land a big need when you talk about? I mean, in terms of capital, say in Bolivar County, they got to a point where they had these ideas they were going to start selling kind of canned processed soul food in Chicago.
Yeah.
They got to a point where they needed a canner.
Yeah.
Couldn't, for a whole variety of reasons, get the money to buy it, which was the next step.
Right.
And, things moved backwards in a sense from there. But they did have land and stuff, but was actually buying land and finding productive land a need that people had?
Oh, yeah. I mean, even your small renters or sharecroppers and whatnot, especially the small renters, wanted to move away from a renting situation into buying their own land. And we did help a number of folks buy that. LC and them had a very different situation, and it was a situation that was much more idealistic than we had with other agricultural cooperatives. They had the land itself was owned in common, and some of the crops were cultivated in common and harvested in common, collectively and whatnot. In most of our situation, you had the individual renter or small landowner coming together around their individualistic resources, land resources and whatnot. Although, most of the renters, I say all of them were really interested in owning their own parcel of land, even as small as 2 or 3 acres, if they had, because we had rationalized some activities that would require just an acre or 2, and for incomes of $2,000 or $3,000, on small crops, and vegetable production, truck cropping, and integrated with some small farm animal activity, what have you. But they had an extremely difficult situation. We tried to help them, and they had so much opposition locally. I guess you went into that. And then the internal problems you always have to deal with. But sometimes, when the external pressure is so great, it inhibits your ability to deal with your internal problems and to build the bonding that's needed and the level of trust that you need, and all that. And when that occurs, then it's almost an impossible situation. Yet on an almost similar a situation in Albany with Charles Sherrod and his new communities project over there. And I mean, I would support people who wanted to go that route, but if they would ask my opinion, I would tell them that, people have to reach a transcendental level much beyond where we are at this particular time. And I think we can move up to that, but to start off initially with that type of activity, it's just too hard. I would try to convince people not to start with a commune in the sense,
Right.
Now some of those have worked because you've had people to be so motivated that they could endure all of the internal dialectics and dynamics that occur. But I wouldn't encourage folks to start off that. They're just not conditioned. Unless they come from a spiritual community like the seminary, where you do have that kind of situation. But, you know, folks that have been doing this for 100 years, you know, it took them to maybe reach that particular point.
Yeah. We're,
But back to the land point, that was that just was a strong desire on the part of all of our folks, agricultural folks, and whatnot. They wanted their own land.
If they had that, I mean, if some kind of more equitable distribution of land in the South had in fact been a possibility,
yeah.
100 years before, and in 1971 or
Right.
in 1871, that would have made a
That was,
fundamental difference in the potentiality of this type of
That's right.
cooperative movement
That's right.
to actually succeed.
that's right. That's right.
Yeah, I think
That's right.
I mean, I think
I would
that's a
agree with you.
critical point.
I would
Yeah.
agree with you 100%. Our job would have been made much easier
Yeah.
because, you know, like that small land base, you can do a lot with it.
Yeah.
And you don't, especially with the problems we had with the cotton industry and boll weevil and all of that, and the other row crops. Once, you know, once the farm sector transformed itself into a more capital-intensive type of operation, you know, the small farmers just really couldn't compete.
Yeah.
At that particular point, you know, it was time for them to attempt to rationalize another type of agricultural activity. And we were saying that we could offer that to them. And we did offer it to those who own land and to some of those who were able to consistently rent sufficient land to do that. But if you had that base already established for a number of years or so, they would have been able to make that transition much more easily. And they would have had the capital base that they needed to attract the resources that we couldn't provide or could only complement, you know.
Did you work with, what's this guy's name? Watley, Dr. Watley?
At Tuskegee?
Yeah.
Yeah. He came up with a nice model that we use, you know, his $20,000 a year or something like that model.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Booker T. Watley.
Yeah, Booker T. Watley.
Yeah, we worked with, we've done some work with him. We've had him down at the Federation, and we experimental. We use the farm, all EPS facilities as an experimental farm for intensive vegetable and small and animal cultivation and whatnot. And that was part of our training program. We would take folks from the cooperatives and bring them to EPS for the training experience and whatnot.
How successful was that
Well,
enterprise?
Well, it never became self-supporting itself. The experimental aspect of it never was sufficiently self-supporting, you know, and so that operation had to be subsidized at the training center. But it provided sufficient transferal training and technical assistance abilities. It was not viable economically because the folks couldn't pay what they had to pay or should have paid for the training itself.
Yeah.
Had they done that, then I think we would not have lost on the experimental farming operation.
But that's one of the services, that's one of the things
Yeah.
that, I mean, supposedly foundations and the government should be paying for. I mean, it's
Right.
millions of dollars supposedly training and educating people. That's
Right.
an important form of it.
Right. I think, too, you know, when you talk about those types of activities, you have to also talk about the larger community and rethinking the economies of those local communities and whatnot. There are so many irrational things we do in those local economies, you know, that I think need to be addressed. I mean, so much can be done locally that would eliminate the need to import food into the area and having to pay all the middlemen costs, and the cost of transportation, which makes the product when it gets to our community, so costly. Yeah. And it just seems to me that agricultural production in this country is just so irrational, and it just got caught up in this irrational dynamic, and to change would cause too many political problems for people and all of that. The region itself has sufficient land base and climatic conditions to be able to support its need entirely. Yeah. I mean, wouldn't have to import food from California and other places and whatnot, but if we had that type of thinking within our agricultural extension services and what have you, supporting us and our limited thing, then our activity would have been more viable.
Did you have much of a relationship with the ag?
It evolved. In some states we had better relationships than in other states. Yeah. We had good relationships with Tuskegee, pretty good relationships at the University of Georgia. And with your black land grant colleges, we had good relationships. Yeah, and Southern and Alcorn, and those places and whatnot. But we just did not make sufficient headway with those folks to be able to. We had some opposition in the black land grant colleges because they too were trained at your white institutions and all that. So they brought back concepts and that were impractical for the small farmers and whatnot. I think if we had a more supportive environment that was thinking more in terms of regional self-sufficiency as far as food was concerned, it would have made our task much more easy. But there's just so many battles you can fight. That's right. And all that. And you're in a very awkward position as far as those folks are concerned. Here we are, novices and rookies, talking about those kinds of concepts. And, and plus we're black. Right. And so we didn't have the standing, authoritative standing, I guess, or comity necessary, to get them to listen to us long enough. But I just think it's just that is a problem, and I still think that something should be done along those lines, just rationalizing production in this country in a different way.
What about the political opposition to the Federation? It seems to me in the stuff that I read and reading back through that article that Tom Bethel, and just some other papers and some other stuff it gives you some indication of a certain level of success.
Oh yeah.
And actually making. Here's an organization that's having an impact in places where it wouldn't be generating the kind of opposition it does. How disruptive were these various? There are numbers of them, not just the FBI or the district attorneys or whatever.
Yeah. Let me put it this way. Over time, it takes its toll on people. I always decided and got the support of my board that those kinds of external attacks or efforts to harm the organization was a responsibility that the executive director needed to assume on his own, and to involve as few people as possible in the defense of the organization, because if everyone had to be involved in the defense, then the work of the organization would be neglected. Yeah. So, although that was the best decision to make from a rational standpoint and all of that, I did not realize how exacting over time that would become. And by the time they came after us with the federal investigation in 1980, in the 2 years that it took to deal with that situation, I was really out of. I just couldn't go anymore. But I stayed another 2 years because I felt that we needed to put the Federation back on course. I didn't realize how destructive that investigation had been until I went back to the funding sources, and they were a little cool towards, fearful of supporting the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. It was almost as if, since we it was implied that we might have been doing something wrong, that we were really guilty, and that if the feds could mount an attack on you of that magnitude, then we ought to just back off. Yeah. But I also believe that, this is just often an opportunity, an excuse for some of them to do something else, and who were not entirely convinced that we were doing the right thing, or whatever their reasons were. Mm-hmm. But I think that the well-being of the organization was defended sufficiently, and the other folks and the younger folks who had not had to endure some of the things that I and some of the other senior level employees had to endure were able, to assume responsibilities and keep the continuity going. What was also happening in the latter part of the 70s and towards the end of the Carter administration, it just became so obvious to us that the federal resources were shrinking. And Boone was right in that description or analysis the other day, and that we had to rethink how we were going to raise external resources from the public sector. Mm-hmm. And for 2 years, I had been grooming certain people in the various states and introducing them to state legislators and other state bureaucrats to start developing relationships and developing proposals and securing their support for those things. Mm-hmm. Ralph Page was head of the field staff of the organization, and he was the one that I was trying to bring along, and I thought that he was doing well enough to be able to adjust to the new circumstances that the Federation had to deal with, and I wanted him to, even before the Federation investigation occurred, I wanted him to consider running for that position even then. But he just didn't have the self-confidence that he needed, and he refused, and he threatened to leave if I would leave. Mm-hmm. Then the investigation come, and we had to put that development. Well, we never put that development off aside, but I had to put my work that I was doing with him aside, helping him to develop the self-confidence that they needed. But by 84, he was ready, and so I left, But that is
I think we're all set, thanks.
That was, yeah, I don't care for it. You always have to contend with that, and when you're young, you don't realize how exacting those pressures are. I think now I would deal with the pressures much more directly than I did. I would not push them under a rug and think that they were not doing any damage. I would take specific steps to deal with this, personally, on a personal basis. I would probably take vacations and spend more time with my family, and doing those kinds of things.
Well, that's an interesting. I don't know. We won't have time to go into that, but I think that's if we, I don't know, if Pew gives us more money to do this, and people are interested in doing it at some point. That was an issue that a number of people talked to me about while we were in Greenville. was how to combine. I mean, how to help people, how to help leaders in organizations like this understand the particular role that they have to play, the particular pressures on them, the particular things they have to do, and how to develop a kind of a more balanced life that makes them a more effective organizer, a more effective leader, a more effective spokesperson. That that these questions of leadership, of how leaders function, and the kind of an actual leadership training, and also leadership development, how you pass your insights and understandings, the kind of knowledge that you're just talking about right here. How do you pass that on to some 25-year-old today? Okay, thanks. Just go ahead and put it on your room and we'll just pay for it.
Can I borrow a pen? Gratuity here is 17%.
Do they add that straight to it?
They didn't add it here.
Oh.
But should we?
Okay, that's fine.
$1.70? Well, I'll give it $2.
Give it $2.
You're right, and I think I think that should be done. I was very fortunate to have the wife that I had, who had a high respect for being a homemaker.
Yeah.
She always wanted to be a mother and wanted to, be at home taking care of the family. Mm-hmm. And she was very proud of doing that. And she believed enough in the cooperative movement to allow me to spend a considerable amount of time, not as much as I did, but a considerable amount of time away from home, and to assume a great many of my responsibilities as a father. Mm-hmm. But still, I didn't balance my responsibilities to the Federation and to my family the way it should have been balanced. I ate, slept, and drank the Federation, and the family was secondary, Yeah. And I say this not very pridefully. I say this, very remorsefully. If I had it to do over, I would have balanced it much, much differently. And I find myself even now, although two of my children have reached their majority and are married, trying to find ways to compensate for that, And then I have a grandchild, and I spend more time with the grandchild again because of the guilt that I have, I also find myself in an awkward position, The other thing, after working so long in the community and whatnot, and you do get burned out, and to a certain extent in 86, there were elements of burnt out, and I don't know if it happens with everybody, but I was and still am in such a state of financial destitution. It's hard to get the type of assistance that you need to build up the energies so that you can go on and all that. It takes twice as long. It probably would have been, it could have been attended to in a very short period of time. Mm-hmm. And then you got to go through all of the pain and whatnot, and it takes time to do that. And then then if you are unlucky like I was, they have some physical problems. The back, I had 2 back surgeries.
Oh, no, really?
In the last year and a half or 2 years or so, then that just compounds the financial difficulties and the pain that you are already enduring. There should be a way to enable folks to make transitions from the on-the-line sort of firing line kind of work that they do, and to be able to do something maybe a little more indirect, but still share with them the benefit, to be able to share with other folks that subsequent leaders share with them some of the benefits of those experiences and whatnot. And you know, that's, I don't know how I don't know how you do that, but I don't think the director of any kind of organization should overstay his welcome.
Yeah.
I think times change so much that you need different kinds of personalities to perform different kinds of responsibilities. It was very easy for me to realize that I had been conditioned in a certain way to be able to deal with funding sources and membership needs in the climate of the late 50s and 60s and early 70s. But after that, you know, like things were changing so much, you need a different kind of orientation to deal with the same kinds of problems. And I saw, you know, it was easy for me to recognize within the organization the kinds of people that would fit those roles much better. And I tried to force them to assume much more responsibility on top of what they were already doing. And Ralph Page is a point in case, you know. And I hope Ralph has the insight to see that too, because things are changing pretty fast right now. Yeah. Thank you, dear.
Thank you.
God bless you. And that, you know, even if he's able to change, then that's fine. But if he can't change, he needs to bring somebody else in to be able to deal with that. And you wear your welcome out in the funding community because you have to challenge a great deal, and folks get tired of that, and they want to hear another voice and somebody else.
That's right.
So, and for these organizations, continuity is just so important. You know, you just can't allow for discontinuity to obtain from leadership overstaying its time or not recruiting the appropriate personnel to take over once somebody leaves, and to make the adjustments to institutional changes that are occurring, and what have you. But you know, I hope some of this will, and some of the insights that you're getting from the range of people that you are interviewing can be synthesized in a way that could be transferable to newcomers to this field of work and what have you.
Really, that's something we've really got to work on. I mean, I think that we really do, because I think we are learning a lot of things, you know, very, you know, different ways and different points of view about what you're talking about.
Well, you know, and I don't know if you've had a chance, excuse me for cutting you off, but a chance to talk to the folks in Arkansas, Ollie and what's in the Calvin King. Now, I'm impressed to no end with Calvin King. I think Calvin King has been able to utilize and benefit from the experiences of folks who were involved prior to his time, and to take the good and to go with that. Plus he has a great many talents himself and whatnot. He has an abundance of energy, and he reminds me of me when I was his age and younger. And I'm not, I don't consider myself out in the pasture right now. You know, I still have some more energies and a contribution to make. The last chapter hasn't been written in this life.
That's right.